Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Today we are joined by former Senator Norm Coleman. Coleman served as mayor of St. Paul from 1994 to 2002, switching from a member of the DFL to a member of the Republican Party in 1996. Coleman went on to serve Minnesota in the United States Senate from 2003 to 2008. Senator Coleman is a Jewish American and in 2009 became an advisor and board member of the Republican Jewish Coalition, where he now serves as national chairman. In 2011, Coleman joined Hogan Lovells, an international legal counsel, where he currently remains as senior counsel. He also currently serves as a member of the National Advisory Council for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which is focused on promoting international engagement. As we have all watched the atrocities happening in Israel, we knew there was no one better to help us break down the situation than Senator Norm Coleman. We are going to start by breaking down the recent terrorist attacks from Hamas that are responsible for the deaths of nearly 1,400 people in Israel. We will break down the history between Israel and Palestine leading up to these horrific actions by Hamas. And then we will break down the path forward and why this is important on a global scale. As a forewarning, we are going to talk about some graphic details of these terrorist attacks by Hamas and the deaths and murders of the Jewish people in Israel. So just wanted to give a little warning. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the show. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Senator. We want to start out with talking about on October 7th, there was the large-scale attack occurred in the early hours of the morning with an estimated 2,000 rockets being launched straight into Israel. It is said the attack by air was to distract from the surge of Hamas terrorists arriving by the ground, via paragliders, and by boat. Can you tell us a little bit about when you first heard about this attack and watched the tragedies in Israel unfold and your thoughts surrounding that?
Yeah, it was at a family wedding. By the way, it was a Jewish holiday. So when in Israel, the Jews were celebrating. I happened to be at a family wedding. And someone said, "Did you hear about the attack?" Well, I kind of tuned in. And just the enormity of it. I just have to just say up front that I've seen pictures of college students with a symbol of a Palestinian, a Hamas terrorist, and a paraglider, as if that's a symbol of courage. Those paragliders went into a music festival and murdered 260 people, raped, pillaged, riddled porta potties where kids may have been hiding with bullets to kill everybody. This was mass murder in the most almost incomprehensible. And I have friends in Israel and friends in government and security, and I'm told things that it's just mind-boggling, and babies, children, grandma, people, just murdered in their beds, throats slit, and kids in front of parents. The brutality of this is so overwhelming that the fact that in some of our college campuses today, kids can be showing with pride a symbol of a murderers, to me is absolutely mind-boggling. It's very difficult for me to comprehend.
Absolutely. I mean, it is, as you said, I mean, horrifying. And as Michael and I were chatting the other day, it's one of those, you want to look away, but it's so important that we don't ignore what's going on. It's really important that we do talk about it. And so we're really grateful that you're willing to do that with us today. So while I know we could certainly spend hours upon hours going into the history of the Israeli-Palestine conflicts and the situation surrounding Israel in the Middle East, could you break down a little bit of that for us and maybe give some insight to some of our listeners about the longstanding conflicts that are there between Palestine and Israelis and how Hamas came to be the horrific terrorist organization that it is?
So Hamas is a terrorist organization. They're funded. Most of their money comes from the Iranians, from Iran, who by the way, fund the terrorist organization Hezbollah in Lebanon. They fund the Houthis in Yemen, who are a terrorist organization. They fund terrorist organization in Syria, Damascus. They control that. And so by the way, they run their arms through. So they get arms from Iran, and then they get them into Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza. And they also control the radical Shia militias in Iraq. So they control, it's like an octopus with tentacles of murder. Houthis are lobbing missiles into Saudi Arabia and into the UAE. January this year, UAE back a series of missiles, and if they didn't have some of what Israel had, it would have been their 9/11. Well, this is Israel's 9/11 times 10. They got 30,000, and actually more than that. So the equivalent of losing 1,300 Israelis being murdered, civilians, civilians, small number of military. These were civilian targets. These villages and communities near the border. A lot of these people, they're peaceniks. They're it's so almost incomprehensible. But you compare that 1,300 to the U.S. Would be as if imagine if 30,000 Americans were slaughtered. What would the reaction be? What would the reaction in the U.S. be? And so you go back. Israel actually pulled out of Gaza. So you have, since Israel's independence in '48, attacked by all the Arab countries, they fight that off. They have the land of Israel. A lot of Palestinians get displaced. They're kind of in Jordan and other areas. And by the way, the chant of "from the river to the sea," when the West Bank is the river. That's the West Bank. It's run by the Palestinians and the PLO, and then Gaza is in southern Israel by the Mediterranean. Okay, they took over, I believe, it was in 2006. They. By the way, they killed Palestinians. They threw PLO folks off the roof. I mean, it was a brutal takeover. And then they ultimately get control and then get elected by the people of Gaza to be there. So now you've got a terrorist organization representing, and that's in the south of Israel. If any of your listeners have been to Tel Aviv, you go Tel Aviv, Jaffa, the old, right, and then you go south of that, and that's Gaza. And so it's bordered. Egypt, by the way, Gaza is bordered by Egypt on its southern border, who's not letting Palestinians through. The Israelis have called upon the Egyptians yesterday and today is let folks get out. I mean, you can set up, tents or whatever, just get them out of the line of fire. But the Egyptians aren't opening up the border for Gaza. They don't want the Palestinians in there, so that border is cut. But Gaza is bounded by Israel on one side and Egypt on the other side. So you've had a terrorist organization. I think you go back and check my history. Been a series of conflicts. But the Israelis basically said, okay, God, they pulled out. They pulled out all the settlers, and they said, okay, Gaza is yours, Palestinians. You govern that, and that's what you have there. And since it's Hamas took over, it has been Israelis kind of blockaded that. Okay, and so you get humanitarian supplies get through and everything else, but have tried to keep weapons out, but obviously not successful. I just want to make one comment again for your listeners. If you think about this, you saw what happened if Israel were if Hamas were to lay down their weapons, if the terrorists would lay down, there'd be peace. There would be peace. In fact, one of the things that was being discussed was the normalization between Israel and Saudi, and a lot of people feel that it was that. And by the way, if that had been done, the Saudis had said that they would, ensure that the great benefit of Palestinians, economic benefit, really kind of help lift them up. But some folks, the terrorists, Hamas, they don't want peace. They don't want normalization. They don't want, you've seen that with the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. And so the possibility of Saudi was next. And I have to give full disclosure, I work with the Saudis in Washington, so I know them well. But publicly, there had been discussions of normalization. The Crown Prince was did an interview with Brett Baer, and he said, we're closer than you think. Well, obviously, this kind of will put at least a stopper in that for a while. I hope not forever. I mean, the region should live in peace. And if you took Israeli technology, Saudi access to markets, they're like Africa, Saudi capital, UAE financial platforms, you combine them, that region could compete with North America, with NAFTA. They can compete with China, compete with the EU. And that, I think, was the path that was hopefully kind of proceeding. And Hamas said no. And so now you've got a situation where 1,300 Israelis murdered. Israel has to eliminate Hamas. They obviously cannot live side by side with terrorists that want to kill them. Will do everything they can to kill them. So they have to eliminate Hamas. Easier said than done. They have told the citizens in the northern part of Gaza to go south. And they literally distribute flyers that say, move, move, we're going to come in. So they're telling the enemy, we're coming in to get civilians out of the way. But Hamas uses the civilians, Palestinians, as human shields. And plus, they have, what, perhaps 150 hostages, among them Americans. 30 Americans have been killed so far that we know. Perhaps another dozen are held hostage, and citizens from countries all over the world are in this group of 150, whatever it is, number of hostages. So Hamas uses the Palestinians in Gaza as human shields. Israel will have to take out Hamas. They're prepared right now. They've mobilized 300,000 of their citizens to do what needs to be done to rid them and the region and the world of this terrible terrorist threat.
Senator, one of the unfortunate realities that's developed over the last few days since this attack has been the response that's been triggered across campuses and in with among some politicians too about this issue. I wonder if you could talk about that for a second.
It's hard for me, Michael, to grasp it, to get my arms around. Listen, I say that as a Jewish American,
Yeah,
chairman of the national chairman, Republican Jewish Coalition. My family name is Coleman, but it was actually Goldman a generation back. And, due to my father's desire grandfather not to kind of deal with anti-Semitism, changed the name to Coleman. And so it's always been there. But, by the way, I was saying before, if Israel laid down, then if Hamas laid down their arms, there'd be peace. If Israel laid down their arms, there'd be genocide. That's what we saw.
yeah,
We saw the largest massive killing of Jews since the Holocaust. There'd be genocide if they weren't armed. And so, how do when people chant from the river to the sea, that means get rid of the Jews.
correct.
About Israel. It's not about two-state solution. It's not about people living side by side. And so I don't know. Maybe it's on the left. It gets tied in with Israel is seen as the colonial power. This small country, by the way, that's a democracy that has Arab citizens with equal rights as Israelis. So there's an Arab population, and they have the same rights as Israelis. Women have rights, gays and differ from what you have in Hamas, what you have in Gaza,
Correct.
or a number of other areas. And so it's hard for me to put my arms around it. How can you? I mean, I watched, watching some conversation on Fox and one of the networks, even CNN, talking to some of the pro-Palestinian protesters, and they were actually denying that they took place. The Hamas, the PLO spokesperson was saying all the Palestinian, all the Hamas targets were military targets. There were no civilians. Right? They broadcast. They broadcast their massacres, their brutality, because they posted it on social media. They show the slaughter of these kids at a music festival. That was not a military target. And you go see, whether there were 40 babies whose throats were slit or 20. What's the difference? Okay, you see pictures of cribs and lined with blood, and eyewitness accounts of horrors you can't even conceive. And so, how in the midst of this can you not say, I feel for the plight of the Palestinian people? Hamas, by the way, is not helping. They use Palestinian, they use Gaza citizens as human shields. Okay,
Hmm.
but to somehow to even at in any measure, just so there is pure, unadulterated anti-Semitism. It's hate the Jews, it's kill the Jews, it's hard for me to fully grasp. The good news is a lot of people are speaking out. A lot of our allies are speaking out. It's been tougher with some of our friends in the Gulf region, but and in part because sadly enough, I think folks within that area have been taught to hate the Jews. They're taught that in school. If you look at some of the curricula, of tells you they're taught. If you have 6 Jews and you kill 3 of them, how many Jews you have left? It's so deep, it's so ingrained. But the fact that on our college campuses, places that are supposed to, what about those safe spaces that all those lefty kids are looking for? Don't talk to me about safe spaces anymore. Okay, they're out there celebrating the massacre of women, children, elderly. This folks who are sleeping laying in their beds or celebrating a Jewish holiday, and the subject of this kind of slaughter. And so you ask a great question that I don't have an answer to. I don't know, but all of a sudden you're seeing it. I think it's a shame, and it breaks my heart.
Becky and I are trying to have thoughtful discussions on this podcast, but it's anti-Semitism. There's no other way to describe it. It's a tough charge to make. It's a tough phrase to say, but that's the reality of what it is. It's just ugliness, and it's this belief. It's just been really troubling to see. I had thought we had moved farther along as a society. It's been a real ugly awakening.
It is an awakening. You think this would be an easy one? This would actually be an easy one. Folks say this is wrong, terror is wrong. Now let's deal with the concerns that folks have about Israel and about the PLO, about dealing with Gaza. Let's talk about some of those concerns. Can more be done on the humanitarian front? Israel, a number of times, Israel, you go to Oslo, another way, Israel offered up, I mean, close to saying, we could get, peace, and was always turned down. And at this point in time, I'm not sure what the path is, other than one, you have to rid the region of Hamas, and that will come at greater cost. And unfortunately, they're going the Hamas uses what they call with dumb bombs. The target is kill civilians. They're not target. Israel focuses on military targets, but if you put your rocket launcher inside somebody's in a hospital, or you store all your munitions in a school, okay, which they do, Israel has to take out those missiles and take out those armaments, and so in the end, it's just a very ugly situation. But there's no more living side by side with folks who are prepared to kill you, have shown the willingness to kill you, and unfortunately, were very successful in killing massive numbers of your population, and it can't happen again.
Now, I want to. This is something, and I don't know. I'm assuming it's just a blatant ignorance or on my hopefully rose-colored view of the world. Was this attack of this scope and scale surprising to you, as well as the anti-Semitism that came out? I obviously we've seen you know, one-off, attacks or occasions or anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic statements from some folks, some of elected leaders we have in our state, unfortunately. But the level I have seen has, I guess I believe I was really ignorant to think it was not as widespread as that. As a Jewish American, were you also surprised to see this, or does this not surprise you?
Well, I think everyone was surprised, and that's another discussion as to how an assault of this magnitude could have been planned and taken place without either Israeli or U.S. intelligence. The Israelis always pride themselves on great intelligence. They prided themselves on having a system they thought would protect its citizens. Countries have an obligation to protect their citizens, and if they don't, then there's a problem, and that will have to be dealt with. That's a conversation down the road. So yes, I think the world was surprised by the enormity of this. What I've seen is they had incredible intel on the military forces that are in that area. The plan was to kill civilians. The documents that they've kept, the plan was to go into these communities, these kibbutz, and to kill as many Jews as they could in the most horrific fashion. And unfortunately, they were successful in doing that. So that's another discussion. I think what was somewhat surprised me is uh, the magnitude of that was so profound. It was so, seen on social media. There was nobody's hiding anything here. But you think there at least would have been a reaction to kind of condemn that, but then say, let's deal with these other issues. And the failure to do that, Becky, that's where you get to what Mike's point, and Mike totally correct. As I said, they want to kill Jews. Okay, they in Berlin, I've seen pictures, Jewish stars back on, painted on doors of Jewish homes. That goes back to Kristallnacht and Hitler, and it goes back to the Nazis. This is what you saw. This is Jack here. We all condemn. I think most of the civilized world, 99, condemned ISIS for the brutality. This is ISIS on steroids. And you would think that the civilized world would have condemned that, absent a sense of Jews, and they deserve it. And so, we're going to ignore it. We'll say it didn't happen. So I think that's what surprises me. I think the enormity. We saw people condemn what ISIS did. They did the same here. They slitting throats, raping women, parading women down the street with blood between their legs. And okay, Israel's going to go in to Gaza, and they're not going to be raping women, and not going to be slitting the throats of babies. They will take out Hamas and do whatever has to be done to make that take place. But I think you're right. I think there was something here that somehow didn't flip the humanity switch, which is condemn that. Then deal with these other issues. Talk about them if you want. Do you want to demonstrate freedom of, we do that in this country, but not in defense of brutality, of mass murder at a scale that's hard to comprehend.
So you alluded to it a little bit. I just, in closing here, want to talk about the path forward. We have seen the Israeli military respond in force, give civilian warnings in Palestine of urging them to get out of the region. Sometimes maybe even underhanding or hindering their efforts a little bit, because obviously Hamas probably sees those flyers as well, but doing what they can do. What should we expect here? Is this going to be the next Ukraine months, year-long war? Do we what are we what's your take on what we're gonna see next?
So by the way, the munitions that Israel has gotten from us is like one just infinitesimal compared to Ukraine. So they're in a different capacity. They fight their own fights. However, uh, their big fear is a second front. So you have a little geography. You've got Gaza in the south, but in northern Israel you have Lebanon and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a much more well trained, well equipped. They have thousands of missiles targeted at Israel. And the fear is that Iran, who controls the puppet master, the octopus, and all the tentacles, if Gaza is, if either, Iran either has to decide they're going to sacrifice Hamas, and Israel will go in and take them. I think they have to do it as quick as they can. It's tough fighting in an urban environment, again, particularly with human Iran, Hamas isn't letting the Gazans out of Gaza. A lot of them are trying to go south. Israel is drop leaflets, go south, we're coming in. But you've got that second front. And the U.S. As we brought in kind of major nuclear aircraft carriers, we have a whole kind of group, and now another group's coming in. That's a message to Iran saying, if you open up another front, the U.S., we are not going to let Israel be destroyed. And so the fear is that the Iranians let Hezbollah just kind of unleash their power, which is more lethal and more targeted and at a higher scale than Hamas. And if they do, then what do we do? uh, because Israel then have, so Israel even now, here's the difference though. This will not be a surprise attack. Hamas and Hezbollah comes forward, the Israelis are ready for that, but they do have to pull some of their forces in the north to deal with that, as well as deal with what's happening in Gaza. So this is a very difficult time for the world. And by the way, I give President Biden credit. I think his response, I think his comment speech was tremendous. I think Secretary Blinken has been out there saying we stand with Israel. And he's so I'm giving this administration. I criticize the Afghan withdrawal, criticize their approach to Iran. I think partly we're in a situation where we're not tough enough in Iran, that they lifted sanctions, and they signaled they're going to give them $6 billion, et cetera. But their response vis-a-vis Israel has been really, I think, uh, deserves praise. And so I give them that credit. But the real test will be if Iran unleashes Hezbollah, what does the U.S. do? Do we those carrier groups there are not show and tell. It's not just for a display, of course. It has you have to if you have lethality, you got to be prepared to use it. None of us want that. We don't want this spread wider. But Israel will have to take care of Gaza. They'll have to watch their northern front, Lebanon, and we'll see how it all plays out. Challenging times, Becky.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate your time. We know you got to run. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before you leave?
Now, I think this has been hopefully a good conversation in a difficult time. Pray for peace. Pray for Israel. Pray for all the people in the region. and pray for the destruction of Hamas.
Absolutely. Well, we're so grateful for your time today and hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it is always fantastic when we can hear from Senator Coleman. Obviously, he is far more of an expert on all things Israel, Jewish American. He can relate, he can share more about that than I think either of us can ever fully comprehend and understand. So I'm really grateful he was able to join us. I think it's going to be a situation that hopefully is over sooner than later with Israel coming out on top. Um, I don't think it's gonna be, anytime soon, unfortunately, and so, it's horrifying, but I think it's important that we continue to talk about and educate, our listeners and do our part, in the broader scheme of things to make sure folks are really understanding what truly is going on in Israel.
I was not expecting a Middle East conflict to be a subject of our podcast ever, but it was important to touch on the issue. And from the perspective that we wanted to share was there's no one better to have on than Senator Norm Coleman, and we appreciate the opportunity to have him come on for a few minutes. It is a horrible situation. It is difficult for me to wrap my head around. It is difficult for me to comprehend. The level of anti-Semitism that I've seen is just unnerving. And one of the things, Becky, and I touched on it a little bit when we were speaking with Senator Coleman, we try to keep the rhetoric down a bit and have just honest conversations, but there's no other way to describe it than it's just pure anti-Semitism. There are a group of people in this world that consider people from Israel to be subhuman. And that is not just limited to the Middle East. It's very difficult to watch what's been going on college campuses and some of the activity that we've seen here in the United States in response to these horrific terrorist attacks and the focus and the emphasis and where it's been misplaced. And this is not going to be solved, I think, in a quick manner. Just my take. This has been going on for a long time. But I do think that the brutality of Hamas's attacks is going to reframe the way the Middle East operates going forward. I think that Israel's hand has been forced in a way that it cannot coexist and it cannot operate in the same plane, in the same space that Hamas exists. And as Senator Coleman said, if Hamas laid down their weapons, the fighting would stop. If Israel did, there would be genocide. This wasn't what we had planned for this week. I'm glad we were able to spend some time with Senator Coleman before he flew back to Washington, D.C., and we hope to speak with him again and hopefully under better circumstances.
Absolutely, and I guess I would just encourage anybody who, maybe didn't like what we discussed to educate themselves a little bit. The Israeli are not their government, and any issues saying that this is warranted or okay. These attacks on the women and children and elderly and every Israeli citizen and every Jewish citizen that is being killed under the banner of death to Jews is not a simple territorial issue here. This is an attack on the Jewish people, and it's very clear that that is what it is. And the her I don't even have words of how horrifying, tragic this is. It just truly is, and so I think people just need to remember that that's the case, and this is not a territorial dispute. It is about Hamas wanting to end the Jewish people.
Yep. You said it very well, unfortunately. Very well.
We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show us some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. Again, our website is bbreakpod.com, and then you can find us at Twitter at bbreakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be returned next week. Have a great one.
See ya.